Okay, so we've got a lot of questions today, and I know that folks are really excited to hear from our speaker today, Laura Tamblin Watts, here talking about her new best-selling book, Let's Talk About Aging Parents. Today, we're going to engage in lively conversation with Laura about the book and also about some of the contents within. I'm Joni Sims Gould, and I'm the executive director of the Active Aging Society and principal scientist of the Active Aging research team. I'm so delighted that so many of you have joined us today. I'm coming to you from what we commonly call Vancouver, the unceded ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. Our team works across this beautiful province on unceded lands throughout British Columbia, and we are so grateful for the stewardship of these lands of our First Nations people. Without further ado, I'd like to invite our guest speaker, Laura Tamblin Watts, to join us. Laura, the amazing, incredible Laura Tamblin Watts, is the CEO of CanAge, Canada's national seniors advocacy organization. Laura may also be a very familiar face to you. She's very well sought out for media interviews and as a speaker. Among other things, she teaches law and aging at the University of Toronto and has worked as a lawyer tirelessly defending the rights of older people. She's a true gem within the gerontological community. We are so lucky to have Laura and her strong advocacy as a representative of our country and as a voice of older people and their families. Thank you, Laura, for joining us today.
Thank you for the very generous invitation. I'm coming to you from the area of the Curve Lake Reserve in the Kawartha area in Ontario today at my family's cottage, which has been in the family for 75 years. And I'm here actually actively installing safety things for my 87-year-old parents who are about to come up. So we are talking about aging parents and living it at the same time.
Super, super, super appropriate. Thanks, Laura, for taking time out of your busy schedule and for being with us today. So we'll get into it here. And for folks that are on the line, we're going to keep it conversational. And I know many of you have sent in your questions, so we'll get to those. But I'm so curious, Laura. Tell me about the genesis of this book. What made you to decide to write this gem of a book? Let's talk about aging parents.
I didn't actually want to write a book, Jody. What I wanted to do was have the book. And
Sure.
I mean, I think folks here will be very familiar with this idea of, the guide to pregnancies, the guide to the first year, toddlers, child years, et cetera. If you put all of those together, either from the medical or the legal or the worries, the sociological, the hacks, the tricks, you might get 5 years, maybe 6 years if you really squint at it for, kids going to school. And there are literally thousands of books on these topics. But I wrote for the 40 years that we are probably going to be supporting each other in some way. I want to say I use the terms aging parents or adult children as a short form. This is very much whether it's built family, family of choice, connections, communities, whatever. I mean it to mean whatever resonates within your circles, if you will. And we're also likely going to be providing some type of support for about 6 older people over the course of that kind of 30 to 35 years to 70 to 75 years old. So 6 times. And the journeys are not always the same. We may also be, because we're no longer a sandwich generation, we're a club sandwich, right? We've got 6 generations actively engaged. We're likely to be those aging parents at the same time as they were providing help for those aging parents too. And so whether it's the real medical information done in an easy to understand way, whether it is the stuff you need to know, the hacks about making your house safer, whether it's how to have the conversations and still be able to have, Thanksgiving dinner together, there really wasn't anything. So eventually, after 25 years of waiting for someone to write it, I wrote it myself.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, we're glad you did. And so speaking about this like club sandwich of individuals that are, supporting one another as they age, who is this book for? Who's the audience?
It really is for folks who are about 30 to 35 years old to about 70 to 75 years old. I'm
Okay.
actually supporting somebody who's in their 98 years old right now, and he is his substitute decision maker for his 73-year-old son who's got dementia. The 73-year-old son's got kids in their 50s, late 40s, who've got, kids in their sort of late mid 20s who've got, now grand, kids again. So we were thinking about cross these generations. It really is kind of millennials on up to boomers.
Right. And so for those that are joining us today who may have not had an opportunity to read their book yet, can you sort of give us, this is going to date me, the Coles notes,
You bet.
just the high level overview, and is it meant to read from front to back? Like,
Now,
tell me a
Coles
little,
notes.
tell,
Do we
tell
not
us a
still
little
have
bit.
Coles? Do we not still have Coles notes?
I don't
That
know,
would
do
be.
we?
I don't know. I certainly had them. So the book is divided into 4 big chunks, right? And they're kind
Yeah.
of the way that issues tend to come to you. The book is very much a handbook. So the working title of it, Jody, was the 3 a.m. guide to your aging parents, because everything
Oh,
happens at 3 a.m., right? You're up, you can't sleep, you're worried, it's 3 a.m. The
yeah.
call comes from the police. They've just been called by your mom because she thinks that someone's breaking in and stealing the bananas or the turmeric, right? Your uh your fall that happened somehow happened at 3 a.m., right? It's always the middle of the night, it seems like. And the idea is that you can just sort of blearily half asleep with your glasses like this, reach over, open the thing, and be like, okay, what do I need to know about this? And you can read enough, get the information, close it, and hopefully that you'll get some sleep. So you don't need to read in any particular order. But the 4 big chunks. The first is everything about where you live and that sort of health and supports that go around them. And it starts off really like, can you age at place? What does that look like? What does it cost to install certain things? What is it? How do you think about um, looking at your home in more creative ways? Do you really need to move? Probably you don't. But do you need a main floor bedroom and you don't have one? That dining room that no one has eaten at since 2004? Maybe take the old set out with the china cabinet, put some barn doors on it, and all of a sudden you've got an accessible bedroom on the main floor. Like things like that. It does go into retirement homes. It goes into other ways of thinking about it, downsizing, how to go through with your parents and going through things while actually still liking each other. Or if you never really liked each other, how to survive it. That's fine too, right? We don't judge. This book understands, and again, I'm using that term families in the most inclusive fashion. It is not that 1950s TV show with like Leave It to Beaver. No, if you've got drugs and mental health addictions in your family, you're normal. If you've got siblings who can't stand each other, yeah, join the crowd, right? If you have Susan from Calgary who swoops in and tells everyone to do, and then, swoops away, making judgments about, her unsuccessful brother in the basement who's actually mostly taking care of the parents. But, yeah, that's normal too. So everything about health and where you live and how you stay there and how do you manage that. The second big chunk is everything that you need to know about like dementia, mental capacity, powers of attorney, and it goes into some of the health stuff there, right? And also some of the legal things that you need to know. But again, easy, understandable way, substitute decision making, all that good stuff. The next chunk is everything you need to know about sort of the main health issues, right? So those 2 things go together. So what is macular degeneration? Is it wet? Is it dry? What do you need to know? What about COPD? What can you look for? What are the top 10 things that you need to know in this area? And it also helps you, and you and I talked a lot about falls, right? I spent a lot of time saying don't fall, and here's why, and here's how to not fall. And then the last is about kind of the everything else, right? What about the dad who was running off with his yoga instructor? What about the family member that comes out as gay at 80? What about the alcoholism that your dad has had, and how do you manage it when he's in long-term care? What do you do when you just can't cope, right? And how do you kind of make your way through it? And then the last chapter, the very, very last chapter, the very last one, because everyone wants to know at 3 a.m. You have to be able to make it, easy to find. Driving. What do you do about driving? And so it's got all of these different chunks together. They flow interchangeably, but you can just reach over to your bedside and open what you need.
Yeah, yeah, that's fantastic. And you really do, like, you cover such a breadth of topics. And, certainly many of the ones that I've seen pop up over the years within the context of, the work with the Active Aging Society and in research as well. Now, Laura, you've had opportunity to travel all over the place talking about this book. And as you were writing this book, are there particular parts that are resonating with folks? Like, where do you, what are people buzzing about with respect to the book?
I think, there's the stuff that you expect, right? There's the stuff that you expect. What do I do with my mom with dementia? Like, how do I manage that? 75% of people with dementia will always live at home, right? How do I manage, right? There's certainly skill sets, the scripts. Like, if your dad is like this, try this approach. If your dad is like this, try this approach. This is the nuclear option. You may not be able to save your relationship back, but if you really feel like you need to, do that. So those things were expected. I think what's been really interesting is talking about some of the more hidden issues that have been resonating with people. What do you do if your parent is toxic?
Yeah.
That chapter everyone wants to talk about. What if actually your dad's horrible? Like,
Yeah.
you actually can't stand your father, or it's your stepfather, but you're the only one left, and you kind of feel like you should help out, right? What do you do if your brother is a drug addict and alcoholic, but he's the only one around? And if it wasn't for him, like, your mom would have to go into long-term care. How do you balance risk, right? So I think that, we don't usually talk about families in that way. And I think that's been resonating. And the corollary to that is the chapter on guilt.
Yeah.
And actually, how do you work through, what does guilt mean? What is good guilt? What is bad guilt? How do you check to see if this is a warning sign for something, or if you're just kind of beating yourself up in an unproductive way? Those have been sort of the ones people have been really wanting to talk about.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I can appreciate that. And so tell me, how did you land on the title?
The Let's Talk About Aging Parents, I actually wanted to bring it forward. When I started, and Joni, I'm going to out you, we probably started in the field about the same time. I'd say it's about 20, 25 years ago or something like that. People would say, what do you do? Like, you work with, old people? Or then you start talking about elder abuse. What do you do? What is people abuse older adults? Like, what are you talking about right now? Exercise classes for seniors? Like, what is that, right? And I think that what we've done is we've started to talk about longevity. We've started to talk about maybe aging in some ways. We've got these ridiculous conversations about tsunamis. I was like, I'm a BC girl and lived in Steveston. I have tsunami alerts like everywhere. You don't know what a tsunami is. A tsunami is a sudden wave that you had no idea about. Aging is not a tsunami. We've known about it. So we're more like the frog in the boiling water, right? We've just decided it's all okay. It's all okay. It's all okay. We haven't invested in it. So when I think about this, I actually wanted to say, no, like, let's talk about it. Like, let's actually talk about it. So we've been talking about longevity. We've been talking about aging. We make jokes about our own aging. We talk maybe a little bit about ageism. But more and more people are saying things like, oh, I've got to go home on the weekend because I've got to. I say, what do you have to do? I said, I've got to go talk about that. I say, what's under the breath? And when you find out, it's actually that they've got to go home. Dad's got COPD, mom's had a fall, la, la, la. And I'm like, you know what? We should be able to talk about this. And it shouldn't be this cutesy thing. Oh, the family's together for, holidays. Isn't it wonderful? No, it's probably very difficult. And sometimes your parents don't like you that much either. And that's okay, because the last time you lived at home, you were probably 17 and stupid, right?
Yeah.
The last thing I also wanted to do is talk about aging parents, is to dispel some of the myths. So the title, Let's Talk About these sort of 27 essential conversations, was this idea it's not one and done, right? You've got topic areas and you need to have journeys about it. So I wanted this idea of the verb, let's talk about it, right? But it also may be lots of older people have been buying this book and handing it to their kids and saying, see, I'm fine, get out of my business. Like, you can't just go and decide what you're going to do for me. Those aren't appropriate things to do. Have a look at chapter 9.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Laura, we've got a lot of questions that came in ahead of time from the audience, and I had a brief conversation with Laura ahead of this webinar, and I told her I had to be the qualitative researcher. I went through and I tried to make sure that they were thematic kind of in groups. And so if your specific question doesn't come up, I hope that we've sort of captured the essence of it. And there is some room in the chat, and I see that there's some comments coming in. But one of the questions that was repeated over and over again, Laura, was really this sort of essence of timing. How do you know it's time for a parent to move into a supported living facility or long-term care? When do you have that conversation? And in particular, folks are really interested in the case of a person with dementia.
Yeah.
When do you know it's time? And when is it time to have that conversation?
I think there's 2 sets of times. There's the triggering incident. I've had a fall. I'm in the hospital. I've broken a hip. I've gone in. There's a cancer diagnosis. I've gotten some scans back. I've got some neuropathy in my feet, right? Like there's a triggering moment. And that is usually when a series of opportunities come into effect. Now, when is it time? Of course, the answer, Joni, that you and I would give is when you're 18. You should have your wills. You should have your powers of attorney. You should have your active aging plan. Okay, but that's not real. People don't actually do that. I mean, it's nice. It's a nice idea. I would like that, but that's not really it. So there's often a triggering moment. The other one is you make a time. You actually have to make one. You've got to construct a time. And sometimes you can use a calendar as your excuse. So I often say things like, okay, do it in April randomly. Like if you don't have a triggering moment or a particular pressure point, then you're going to have to construct one. So taxes are due in April. Let's do a little review. Let's make it, we're going to talk about taxes. Then we'll talk about banking and estate plans, powers of attorney. While we're at it, what would happen if, right? Another way that you can make up a time, and you've been wanting to have a conversation, but you don't know how to do it or what to do. Okay, what about that giant, I don't know, rainstorm, snowstorm, a fire that gets us evacuated, like whatever else, right? What would you do if?
Yeah.
Right. And, we have a place in Whistler because I bought it more than 20 years ago when regular people could buy a place in Whistler. And, people were evacuated in Whistler. And one of the biggest problems is older people can't get evacuated because there's nowhere for them to go and they often can't get out. Right. And so that's a great conversation. If you're looking at it, you're saying, okay, I see that, Whistler is evacuating, Pemberton's evacuating. So what would we do if? How would we make a plan? Where would we go? And so that is got nothing really to do with, but can help you lead into things. The last thing I would offer is you make it about yourself. Pro tip, right? The thing that I hate, I want to dispel this as a myth, is that you become the parent to your aging parent. No, you don't. You're always the kid. And again, I'm using this as a short form for whatever your relationships are in whatever born, built, or made version that we have. No, you're always the kid. And as I say, they probably remember you not being able to pick up your socks from the floor and, crashing the car in the parking lot, back in the day, right? So they may really respect you, but remember, they probably haven't lived with you for a very long time. So they don't always know you fulsomely as an adult, right? So they think you're young and you think they're impossible or wonderful, but also, out of step or whatever it is, these norms that we have built around us, of which, by the way, none of which are probably true and all of which are true at the same time in the way that narratives happen. But what you can do is say something like, oh, I was doing my fill in the blank, whatever it is. My knee hurts. I was thinking about maybe selling the house. I was thinking about, going down the cabin stairs and I realized I was getting wobbly. I got to redo some investments. I was going to, and that prompted me to think about, oh yeah, they want us to do my new powers of attorney and will. I love your advice.
Yeah.
I'd love your advice. What did you do? Oh, yeah. Maybe could we compare notes? I tried to look to see my parents' wills and powers of attorney for ages, only because I'm appointed in them. It's otherwise not my opinion, but I actually would like to know what the job was. And it wasn't until I was prompting by saying, look, I want to redo it. I'd love your thoughts. So we were able to pull them out. And then I realized that, my dad's will was 20 years out of date and he's a lawyer, right? So sometimes make it not about them, make it about you.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's great advice. And what about the case of moving, right? We've seen this question come up again. Like, how do you know it's time for
Yeah.
somebody to move?
I think it tends to be it tends to be kind of in a couple of different chunks. So the first is, can you afford to stay there? You have to look at the pure finances, right? Because if you have certain resources, you may not need to move. What is it that you would want to achieve? What's the problem we're trying to identify? If the problem is you can't go up and down the stairs anymore, they're too, scary, right? Is it a question about moving or is it a question about living safely? Okay, so if the question is about living safely, it's not really about moving, then let's start talking about maybe you only use one level. Maybe you rent it out to a student above you, right? Maybe you start thinking about different capacities. If the question is like, you can't keep up the house, you can't keep up the farm, you can't keep up the whatever, it's just, it doesn't work for you and it's too much work. Okay, so that's a different conversation. It's not about,
Right.
you can stay there and you can afford to stay there. It really is, no, it's like, it's not appropriate for your aging. It's not appropriate. What if you're in the middle of a rural community near nobody, right? You actually just can't live that far into a rural community anymore. Okay, so then you have to look at it. Usually in Canada, I would say one of the best ways in is to talk about access to healthcare. It doesn't make it about you, doesn't make it about them.
Right.
Right? We can complain about the government or whatever it is that we can complain about. So try to think about a structural thing. That's a third thing. Dad, okay, you live in fill in the blank. That's great. But like, what are you doing for a doctor? What are you doing for, what would happen if, your neighbor, always talk about the neighbors and the friends, right? They may not talk to you about their own health and well-being or what seniors home they might want to live in or what, long-term care home they think is good or bad, but they have lots of opinions probably if they're thinking about staying within the community. So ask about, what happened with Mr. Lee? Oh, he went there. Hey, you hate the food? You don't like that building? Is there one that, one of your friends is at? That you do like. So not making it confronting to them, but hearing about their values, their ideas based on talking about other people in their circle. That's a good way in. Then sometimes there's the approach of, okay, we have to sort this out. Right?
Yeah.
And the what is it that we're trying to achieve question comes into it. Is it that you can't be there because you're lonely? Then let's find community-based services and some check-ins and whatever. Is it because you've got dementia and the reality of circumstances, you can't be living by yourself anymore that far out? Then we need to start getting connected with dementia supports. In the end, I think parents often do know that it's time to move. They just don't want to be told it's time to move. And so anything that you can do that makes it about another thing where they come to the decision or they express it is almost always easier than the nuclear option, which is, okay, look. And then that us or them, that all or nothing approach, it's rarely effective.
Great. Thanks for that, Laura. That's really comprehensive. I'm gonna dig down close to home with your lawyer hat on. We've got a couple of questions around preparation of documents and decision making. And one of the things, of course, that always comes up in the preparation of these documents is the cost.
Sure.
And so the question is, do you need a lawyer or a notary to guide you in preparing all of these documents?
Yes. Okay.
Or are there other ways to prepare these documents, maybe to help mitigate some of the costs?
Absolutely. And I see people all across the country. So the answer to some of these things will depend a little bit regionally. Okay. So in some jurisdictions in Canada, that substitute decision-making document, which if you're in BC, it would be called an enduring power of attorney for financial and property kind of stuff, and would be called a representation agreement if you're talking about the health and personal care stuff. If you're in Ontario, it would be called a power of attorney for property and a power of attorney for personal care. If you're in Quebec, it's going to be a mandat, right? If you are in Nova Scotia, it's going to be a power of attorney for property, and it's going to be a healthcare directive or advanced care directive, right? They're called different things, but it's kind of the same. You need two documents, one to deal with everything about your stuff, So
Mhm.
not it says property, it doesn't just mean like actual physical real estate. It could mean your earrings. It could mean your passwords to your Facebook account, anything that's your stuff. And the other thing is everything about your body and where your body lives, eats, breathes, sleeps, wears, all of the stuff about the body. Those are, imagine you get across the street, you get hit by a bus and you're completely unconscious. These things kick in. Only the ones for property, you have a choice. You can have someone help you out in advance and then it just continues on. So when I didn't want to renew my parking pass by standing in the cold for 3 hours during COVID, my husband was going to go do his. I handed him my parking pass stuff and my power of attorney and said, it's active right away. After you renew yours, put the hat on and then become me and renew mine. And he's like, that's never going to work. I'm like, of course it's going to work. That's what it is. And he came back. He's like, I can't believe it worked. So you have the choice to do that. But when it comes to your health and personal care issues, you can't get anyone else to do it for you. You have to do it yourself, as long as you're mentally capable. When you're dead, you're dead. Those things die with you. They only function as long as you function. When you're dead, then the estate takes over. So everywhere in the country, after you're dead, a will comes into effect. Having said that, only about maybe 40% of people will have active wills. 50% say they do, but usually about 10% actually don't when they say that they do. So it's a low number. You do not need a lawyer at any part of the country to draft a will for you. You should absolutely try to get a lawyer to draft a will for you if you can. There are a bunch of different companies that have online versions that are Canadian. So I really recommend, like, don't go to the drugstore or whatever and buy the written ones. They're almost always legally wrong, but there's at least a couple in Canada. Willful's one of the names. There's a bunch of different ones that are actually pretty good. They're always better than nothing, right? There's always better than nothing, but there's a lot of things that you can do. Most people are talking about capital gains these days and some other types of estate planning. If you can afford to spend a little bit of money on your wills and your estate planning, you'll really benefit from that, but you don't have to. When it comes to powers of attorney documents, right, those two things, one for health and personal care, one for finance, it depends. The answer is it depends. So in BC and Ontario, for instance, you don't need one. Prairie provinces, you often do need a lawyer or a notary to do it. So it does depend.
So just to reiterate, in BC, so
Don't need either. No,
you don't need a lawyer or a notary for those.
for neither.
And
And
you can
there
just,
is the
if
power
you
of
could
attorney
just say the
document.
names of those documents one more time,
bet.
Laura, in BC for those two.
So I'm going to put in the chat to
Perfect.
a representation agreement and an enduring power of attorney are the BC words. For
Perfect.
the enduring power of attorney is all for property, right? Everything's called enduring power of attorney or power of attorney for property. In BC and the Yukon, it's called a representation agreement. That's for your stuff for health and personal care. You can find good information about it at the Office of the Public Guardian and Trustee. And that's true across the country. There's always a public guardian and trustee, and they'll always have excellent information. In BC, you also have the NIDIS registry, which I'm just putting in here, and you can find great this. Can I, some people, Sandra asked me, what's a little bit of money? Look, you can shop for it. Like, sometimes people will do it for a couple $100. Usually you're buying the time. Sometimes lawyers or notaries will sell the service at a flat rate. Will do like your powers of attorney, your representation agreement, and your will for X dollars, right? Big downtown firms often charge more because they usually do, because they've got real estate and people. Small solo practitioners with less overhead often are less. You can usually ask pretty carefully. What I would offer though is, remember you're buying time typically. So if you've got complicated stuff, it may take longer. But what I would say is, whatever amount of money the lawyer is going to charge you, add 3 to 4 more zeros, and that's what it costs if you haven't done it right.
That's fantastic, Laura. That's really helpful. I'm going to move us to another really hot topic that I think you probably hear about all of the time, and it came up a few times within the context of the questions, and that's the conversation around giving up driver's licenses.
Oh, yeah.
Talk to us about the willingness to give up, how to have a conversation about the willingness to give up their driver's license when their health is deteriorating. Now, I will say that the driver's license came up, but there were a number of other things that came up. So it was about it was really about when to have the conversations about risk, because people were also asking about, when should my dad stop playing full contact hockey,
Yeah.
or doing X, Y, or Z, or, but the driving was a big one. Can you talk about driving?
Yeah, it's the very last chapter in the book for a reason, as I say, so people can open to it. So first of all, the good news is most older people are pretty good drivers, and mostly they don't get into that many accidents, right? So if you look at statistically, they're actually not dangerous drivers. Women will typically limit themselves. There's good research behind this. I didn't just make this up myself. Women will typically limit themselves, and men are usually the ones that are a bit harder. That may resonate with people. I'd love to hear in the chat if that does resonate. But there's real actual research in this regard. So one of the ways that I approach it is by trying to get to the limitation first. Oh, Mom, I couldn't believe it. I was taking the highway here. There's trucks everywhere. It's so hard, right? I mean, I had tractor trucks on one side. The rain was coming on the other. I swear I'm not going to drive that highway again unless it's absolutely middle of the day on a Sunday and it's sunny out. And then, they can say things like, oh, yeah, it's been terrible, so scary, right? So sometimes you can get that. Another way, particularly for men, that you could do it is blame changes in technology, right? The stupid other thing. Remember that, those new halogen bulbs that kind of blind you? Oh, Dad, I used to have no problem driving at night. But now they've got those bright, bright bulbs. I'm just blinded when I'm driving. I really have a hard time, and I'm 53. I don't know. Like, do you find that it blinds you too? See if you can kind of open up those conversation points. Now, that may work and it may not work. Have a look to see what some of the tells are. Can they shoulder check? Have they got an eye change, like macular degeneration, cataracts, etc.?
Right.
If you can blame it on something like that, that's easier. Pro tip, your doctor or your parents' doctor are probably not going to help you. This is a myth that the doctor is going to take away the driver's license. It's extremely rare. Doctors hate doing this because then people hate the doctors and then they don't come back to the doctors anymore, right? So on the whole, the doctor is probably, unless it's a very, very long-term friend, or alternatively, you got a specialist and you've got a neurological disorder, the specialist may end up doing something like that, particularly if you've got some kind of thing like a narcolepsy, or you lose consciousness, or you have episodic stuff. But other than that, it's hard, particularly when dementia is the thing that we're not talking about, right?
Right.
So what I would say is this. Try to limit things, try to approach it gently, try to ask if you can't, is Uber a kind of a good idea if you live in an urban environment. Try to see if somebody can swing by and pick up your mom and dad. But sometimes you have to have the conversation. Like, you can't do it any more gently. You actually have to confront it. And in this case, I actually give some scripts. I actually give some scripts on how to do it. If your dad is like this, try this script. If your mom is like this, try this script. If your Aunt Lou is like this, try this script. And it's hard because actually, if your driver's license gets taken away, a huge amount of things go away with it. And it's, historically a thing of freedom and independence. And it also means you can't go to the cottage. You can't go to your friend's house. You can't go to the movies. You become a sense of dependency. This is especially true for people who are in rural communities.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely challenging. And as you said, and in particular, when you've got the layer of dementia or suspected dementia involved as well.
Yeah.
Laura, there have been a number of questions about caregiving responsibilities, and in particular, engaging family members who, are not as active in care. So, you've got the brother who's in town but doesn't help. You've got, a couple of siblings, and everybody could pitch in equally, but they don't. What are your reflections on the different caregiving scenarios? There was a question in the Q&A, very specific question about somebody with a 92-year-old adoptive dad, and kids aren't really there. This person is living with MS, and any suggestions for them as a caregiver?
Yeah.
How do you have these caregiving conversations, and what if somebody's not pulling their weight?
Yeah, so someone's not going to be pulling your weight, just to let you know, right? And what you think the weight is and what they think the weight is also just may not be the same thing, right? And there's also, we have to examine some gender norms and cultural expectations in this as well. Parents may come from a different country and have the expectation they're going to move in with you, and that may not be your expectation. Alternatively, you may think that your parents should move in with you, and they're like, heck no. Mostly they don't want to move in with you. So you have to unpack some of those gender and cultural norms and try to make sure that everyone's a little bit on the same page. That's often what's behind it. The second thing I would say is, before you confront the caregiving circle or morass, depending on how you want to call it, people who you think should be involved in this, check out what community-based social services are available, right?
Mm-hmm.
See what you can get. See what you can get first, and not just through the healthcare system, because that can be limited. But check that, right? Find out. Then, BC's got a great program, for instance, called the Better at Home program, the United Way Better at Home program. Amazing stuff is available. These types of things are in other provinces and territories across the country. So look at what we call CBSS, community-based senior services. There's lots of good stuff out there. So it may be that you actually don't need your brother, who frankly couldn't be bothered anyway, to come by, and you're banging your head against the wall because frankly he's probably not going to do that. But what you could do is ask your brother to help set up the online banking, right? So I think of it as kind of a strengths-based analysis. What are people good at and what are they not good at? And remember, like, that's not going to change, right? So it may be this notion of fair, in many cases, is our biggest enemy. I think about it from a capacity building point of view. What's in the broader community? What's in our skill set? And let's unpack what we think that mom or dad or aunt or Susan or the neighbor who we're taking care of or whoever it is, what is it that they need? And then let's match that with what we have. In the book, I literally have an asset map where there's a million different things that you can do and you can fill it in. You know what? Maybe you don't need your brother to come by and shovel the snow. Maybe the neighbor's kid will do it for like $5, right? Helps the neighbor's kid too. So problem solving instead of dread on, let's look at it. And the chapter can help you go through it.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Laura, you raised something really important. You made a comment. You said, like, look at the community-based services sector and to see what's out there, because maybe the health system may or may not have it. And there were some questions about like healthcare navigation and the complexities in doing that. So one of the participants said, is there any kind of document out there that explains how public health system works in plain language? There are many different titles people have, but what do they actually mean in the order that things have to happen? So, thinking about really anybody navigate, like healthcare navigation, any sort of comments or reflections on healthcare navigation?
Yeah, I do. In fact, there's more out there than you think. It's hard to find, but once you find it, it's a treasure trove. So my pro tip, you can go in through one of two ways. If it's a diagnosis question, right? I see somebody here, Audrey is talking in the chat about her husband has got some cognitive issues. So say it's, for instance, a dementia. Audrey, I don't know if your husband is actually suffering from a dementia, but if he's living with a dementia, that's a good example. It could be another neurological condition or whatever. But let's take dementia as an idea. Really, the first place you should go is the First Link program at the Alzheimer's Society. They are an umbrella that will help to connect you. And so you actually don't need to go in through the healthcare system. What you need to go is in through what the diagnosis is, okay? Cancer is another really good example where there's excellent navigation points. And you will get that through the Cancer Society, but you will also get it at the hospital where you're being treated or the outpatient facility or wherever else. There is often a cancer navigator. I know it's crazy, but there you go. Then using that as the jumping off point, in every major healthcare location, hospital is a good example, but community clinics are also there. There are social workers. And if it's not really clear how you should be navigating, ask to talk to the social worker. The social worker will be assuredly that person that can help you get connected. Don't forget also about 211. Across this country, 211, you just dial it for free and say whatever your problem is. It doesn't have to be really super narrow. I need help figuring out my way through, and I live in Terrace, and I live in Winnipeg, and I live in, Port Hope, whatever it is. And 211 can help you. Now, it's not going to be perfect, but it will help.
Yeah, and a good starting point for folks.
It is a good starting point. Honestly, the social worker is the thing that unlocks it.
Yeah. Thanks, Laura. couple of questions came up around assessing the competency of foreign trained personal support workers or community health
Mhm.
workers. So just to break that down for folks on the webinar, this is a question coming in. People are asking if you want to hire your own care staff. So you're bringing somebody into your home. You're not necessarily going through the public system, and you want to hire somebody. How do you assess their qualifications?
So my quick answer is you probably can't.
Yeah.
Not really. I mean, the best and easiest thing to do is to hire an agency to match you.
Yeah.
And we do that as well with nannies for kids, right? How do you assess whether or not a particular person has the qualifications they really need, has the competency, has the whatever? And if you go through an agency like a nanny agency or even a tutoring agency, they've done the background checks. They've done the vulnerable persons checks. They've done temperament checks. And you can call up an agency and say, hey, I need somebody who is really willing to deal with my dad's racist jokes and really willing to remember that my dad thinks it's 1973 and is also willing to go for big walks because my dad really likes that. And also needs to be able to manage his COPD and his blood pressure medications, right? And they're not going to give you that person that doesn't able to do those things and that will have done those checks, right? Now, assuming you don't have an agency that's a matching or screening one, and you're really doing it yourself, I would say, it's a combination of that same type of thing. You should do your vulnerable persons checks through the police. No, some people may not want to do that. May be working off book. They may be feeling uncomfortable about it. You have to make your own risk analysis about that.
Right.
When it comes to doing checks on whether they have qualifications, the reality is we don't actually need a lot of qualifications to be a hands-on care supporter for older people across the country. Actually, like a lot of the courses are 6 weeks. And so if they've done a Canadian trained course, it's easier to find that out, right? I mean, that's my first question is, have you done any Canadian training at all? If they haven't, they may have done other training. If they are, for instance, that typical like RN from the Philippines, they probably have great training. Like that's the reality. Germany has just built a purpose-built nursing school teaching German curriculum in the Philippines and spent $1 billion to create Filipino German trained nurses. So there are some places that are a bit more easy. What I would say in the end is, if you've got someone that's a great person and really just need somebody to be with them and to do some basic training, you can also pay for that person to have got that training. Maybe some first aid courses. You can actually try to say, I think that you're a really good fit. Let's get you into the St. John's ambulance courses. Let's you do those types of things. And if they're willing to do that, that's great. The corollary is you get them to take your dad to their health meetings, and really what they are is a companion, and maybe try to differentiate the difference between somebody who's going to provide sort of medical care and someone who's going to provide companion care.
Great, Laura. And I can see that there are some suggestions in the chat from, like, for example, Chilliwack senior peer counselors around care aides working from them on the side. So I think, again, it really speaks to there's no one way to do this, right? That people are finding their ways through. And that's why your book is such a great template to sort of get people going. But there's also a lot of community-based services out there that you can connect with. But at the end of the day, a lot of it really relies on you as an individual to sort of navigate. And to that point, there's been a couple of questions about navigating long-term care in the public system. So first question is around, how do you get assessed for long-term care? And then the second question is there some kind of a rating about what is a good facility and what is a bad facility? How do you know once that assessment process has gone through, if there's a decision to be made, how to make that?
Let me answer the second part first. So my book takes you through it. So there's a whole chapter on how do you actually figure out what's good and bad, right? And so you can literally go through the chapter and, I'd say, look, ignore the paint. It's not really about the paint. How do you, check with the staff, see what it looks like, see what's valuable to that one person. And that's really, really important. Just because what you think is valuable isn't necessarily, what somebody else finds valuable. That is above and beyond what you would expect for a basic standard of good care. Okay. So I'm just talking about the nice stuff. So
Right.
for instance, I was working with an older person who was in the interior of BC, and he needed to go into long-term care for a number of mostly physical reasons, but some neurological ones as well. And I was asking him what's important to him, and all he said was, "I don't care, just no country and Western music playing." It's like,
Fair.
what? It's like, yeah, I would rather actually die than live in a place with country western. I was like, that's a very passionate thing you're saying. So we went through 5. Sure enough, 4 of them played country and Western music. And I was like, okay. I mean, so for that person, it's important to
Yeah.
remember that when you're looking at personal choice, what was important was not looking at the gardens or being near a lake or, being next to a Tim Hortons. For him, it was a musical choice. So the book helps you go through that. On a more serious note, most provinces, but not all of them, will have ratings when it looks at how many citations and such. BC has a pretty good one. I have to say,
Yeah.
Ontario's got a pretty good one. Manitoba does not have one at all. It's completely locked up. And so it can be a little bit difficult to try to find out what's going on. I want you to remember when you've seen the ratings, like incident reports need to be read with a bit of a wary eye, because you could get cited for having a wet towel on the floor. And that's very different to me than chronic abuse of a patient, right? So you're going to have a look, you got to kind of read it a little bit. Usually word of mouth and what you're looking for also depends of community. So whether it's people that they know who live there also, so they'll have some friends, or it's in an area that they also know so they can stay connected. So often physicality and connectivity with other people or communities is really important. Now, the first one, how do you get assessed? It's different in every place and also kind of the same in every place, right? You are going to trigger somebody, usually through a medical appointment, typically, although some places you can actually call a number directly and say, like a home and community care number for the government, and say, I actually think my mom needs to be assessed. Some
Yeah.
places you need to go through a more formal process, but
Right.
you just check. You can literally Google, how do I get assessed for long-term care in your particular community? And it will tell you. At which point they're going to check the same thing. And the book goes through this as well. They're going to check what we call activities of daily living, ADLs. And it's kind of, can you manage on your own is the answer. The reality of a circumstance, however, is you have to offset that with a bit of a level understanding about that there's going to be a waiting list, and it's very triage based. The new numbers for Ontario long-term care just came out for the waiting list. Okay. Formally, there are 44,000 people on the waiting list.
Oh my goodness.
Informally, it's more like 60,000 people on the waiting list.
Yeah.
And almost 60% of people in retirement homes in Ontario are also on the waiting list, right? So when you're thinking about, they're at the bottom of the waiting list. And so every different jurisdiction will depend. So, if you're in Winnipeg, the waiting list was like 500 people not that long ago, right? So you have to understand it does depend on where you're going to be, what the process is. When they're checking your activities of daily living, they're going to also check to see if you have any other supports. And this is a thing I want to flag. So if you're, 4'11", 90-pound mother is saying, oh no, I can cope with her 250-pound wife who has neurological disabilities, who needs a 2-person transfer, and who needs help feeding and toileting, but she keeps saying, no, we're fine. No, we're fine. They're probably going to ignore her. Like, okay, you're fine. I mean, that's not what should happen, but that's often what happens, right? Yeah. And so part of the conversation isn't just trying to get the one person to accept the fact that they need to be evaluated. It's actually getting the other person to accept the fact that they can't take care of them on their own anymore.
Right. Yeah, I mean, again, and it just speaks to that strong advocacy role that folks need to provide for themselves and for those around them. Now, I could ask you questions all day, Laura. I'm going to put out a last call in the chat or in the Q&A button for anybody else if they've got some final questions. While we're waiting to see if there's a final question or two, Laura, I want to ask you, I mean, this information is so important. I can see in the chat that people it's really resonating. It's really helpful. Any plans for a second book?
Oh yeah, I'm already writing it.
Yeah. Do tell.
Well, there's 2 more in the series for sure. Right. When I did it, it was going to be a series of 3. So the first is let's talk about aging parents with dementia. It really should be let's talk about aging parents with cognitive impairment, but it doesn't roll off the tongue quite as well. So you'll see in the book that we have, there's an entire chapter or 2 on dementia, but there's also a giant chapter, beforehand about everything else that affects cognition that's not dementia, right?
Right.
And that's lots of things. UTIs. It could be that they had a post-surgical delirium 6 months after that root canal they had, right? That they're mixing their meds and their grapefruit juice and all kinds of other stuff, that they are, not taking their blood pressure at the right time of day, that their glucose levels are wonky, that their iron and their glucose and their B12 are messing each other up, right? That they're taking all their medications, but they're not telling you about like that Chinese medicine, traditional herbs that they're also taking for health, but actually are real medicine that are, of course, just from a different background, often the same kind of medicine that you're taking in a refined form. So you're doubling up the medicine in those ways, right? All of those things are important. The reality of circumstance is already, as I said, 75% of people with dementia will never live in congregate care. And as you know, only about 5% on average across the country, 4 to 6, depending on where you are, will ever go into long-term care at all. And so everybody who goes into long-term care now will essentially have dementia. Like that's what happens when you bring these two things together. But dementia is not good enough. It's going to be, and kind of already is in a lot of places, you've got to have significant dementia, not moderate, not mild, significant dementia. You can't toilet, you can't bathe, you're falling regularly, and you're a risk to yourself or other people. That will get you maybe in. Usually you're going to have 2 other chronic conditions. So this idea of frailty is going to be so frail. And at a time where every new long-term care home bed costs $1 million, every single new bed, not the building, the bed, like the space for one person is $1 million. So we don't have a system that works. What we need to do is create one ourselves. So the next book's going to be called Let's Talk About Aging Parents with Dementia. So you can deal with the fact that 95% of the people will be at home in some ways, and many of them will have dementia. The next one is going to be a deeper dive into kind of aging in place and all the great things you can do. How to create a naturally occurring retirement community. How do you figure out how to create a contract to share a caregiver on a paid basis? How do you get the tricks of the trade? How do you get a contractor to come in and fix up your house in a really pragmatic way? If you had $20,000 to spend on your house and you wanted to stay there for 5 more years, how would you spend that money, right? And note that I picked $20,000 out because it's also the amount of money that's a refundable tax credit in Canada. So you can actually write it right off. Now you still have to have the money, but you write it right off your taxes. So lots and lots and lots of these things on a practical basis are the next 2 books.
Amazing. Amazing. That's incredible. I see we've got one last question.
Yes.
Which actually is a really beautiful last question. And that really takes it to the next level. Like, how as a community do we support people caring for aging parents, siblings, and a friend? What can we all do?
I think let's talk about it. Honestly, and I mean, I think that talking about it and destigmatizing it is probably the very first step. The second is build community. And Joni knows that I actually tell people, what's the best thing you can do with your aging? Get an active aging society going and start doing that, right? A combination of physical well-being, social well-being, connection, reducing loneliness, creating those opportunities for exchange of care, of fun, of relief, of scaffolding each other. That's actually what we need. And then addressing the fact that caregivers often become unwell at a much earlier rate and often die before the person they're taking care of.
Yeah.
And that is really going to be very impactful given the fact that we have this shape now, an hourglass shape. So I'm in a Gen X generation. And it is going to be 6 older people that I will be taking care of. And this is an inversion. It used to be like 20 years ago, it would be 6 younger people taking care of sort of 1 or 2 older people. And now it's the reverse. And it's just not possible, right? It's just not possible. So we as a community have to do that. If you are a business owner or you work in a company, make sure that you get to self-identify in your equity, diversion, and inclusion as a caregiver. And don't just say, are you a caregiver, but actually indicate, or do you have children that you're caring for, older adults you're caring for, people with disabilities you're caring for? Do you ever do these kinds of things? Because many people will not say, I am a caregiver. But then if you ask these questions, they are. In the same way you may not say, I have a disability, but here's 40 different conditions you might be living with. And it turns out You probably do have a disability if you answer from those 40 questions. Have caregiver leave, have really good caregiver leave in your employment. And make sure that you have flexibility in your business to make sure if you are working in business. If you are in retirement, make sure that you are able to find out the what ifs for your financial well-being, because the cost of health isn't free in this country. And that may mean that you need transit. That may mean that you may need a new pair of shoes. That may mean that if you plan to get live-in care 24/7, it's about $300,000 a year. So whatever it is for you, whether it's a new pair of running shoes or $300,000 a year for live-in care, make sure that you've got a financial plan to do it. And those of us who know that, we're always saying, well, you've got the house, you can sell the house, to understand that actually, if you do sell the house, there may be nowhere for you to go. So to make more creative arrangements in our community, co-housing, do Golden Girls style, share housing, get in a home share program where a graduate student comes in and provides you with some help around the house in exchange for a little bit of money. Be a bit more creative. And it's through that community that I think that will actually get the dividend of her healthy longevity.
Wow, Laura, that was a really, really fast hour. I could do another few for sure. And hopefully we'll be able to have you back
Yes,
again.
please. Yes, please.
We would love that. I want to thank you so much. Well, on behalf of myself, the Active Aging Society, our board, and those attendees, for your dedication, for your advocacy, for your energy, and for your book. Let's Talk About Aging Parents. Folks, it's in the chat. Please go get yourself a copy. You don't have to read it from front to back. I jumped all over the place.
No, and it's on
a great
audiobook
resource.
too, which a lot of people
Perfect.
are listening to when they're walking the dog or driving the car. It's on audiobook as well. Please let me
Perfect.
know if it's helpful for you. I just want to close by saying how grateful I am. People say, what's the best thing I can do, to have a healthy lifestyle, to do well, to have that positive longevity dividend. And the thing I say is you should meet my friend Joni. And because the very first thing you should do is actually have, as I say, like one of the active aging societies. That is one of the biggest keys. 40 to 70% of major health needs, including dementias, can be reduced with things like, reducing loneliness and increasing exercise. And it's that building of community that counts.
Thanks, Laura. Thank you so much. Enjoy your time, and I hope your parents appreciate all of the work that you've done at your cottage.
Won't.
No, they won't. We appreciate you.
They won't. But I'll feel better knowing there's hand grips and bed rails, and that's Perfect. Good enough. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Laura.